Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SNIA Networking Storage Forums webcast, Understanding Storage Security and Threats, the first in a series. My name is Steve Vanderlinden. I am a system engineer at Lenovo Data Center Group, and I'll be your moderator today. We have a great panel of SNIA experts for today's webcast. I'm joined by my Lenovo colleague, Pierre Mouallem. Pierre is a security architect with over 15 years of experience in application and product security. Hi, Pierre.
Hello.
Also presenting is Jay Metz of Cisco. Jay is a longtime contributor to the SNIA educational webinars and is a member of the SNIA Board of Directors. Greetings, Jay.
Hey, Steve. How you doing?
Last but not least is John Kim. John is Director of Storage Marketing at Mellanox and is the chair of the SNIA NSF. Welcome, John.
Hello, Steve. Thank you.
Before we dive in, a little about the SNIA organization. SNIA is a nonprofit global organization dedicated to developing standards and educational programs to advance storage and information technology. We have 185 leading organizations participating in SNIA, 2,000 active members, and reach over 50,000 IT end users and storage professionals worldwide. As you can see, the NSF covers a broad range of storage-related topics through educational webcasts like this one, as well as blogs and presentations at industry events. Just a quick note from our legal department. The presentation you'll see today is copyrighted by SNIA unless otherwise noted. SNIA members may use this presentation so long as it is used in its entirety and SNIA is credited. There are no warranties expressed or implied. Use at your own risk. Here's today's agenda. This is the first in a series of storage security webcasts. We'll explain what to expect in future webcasts, discuss the storage security big picture, and provide an overview of important terminology and concepts. You can access today's slides from the attachment tab at the bottom of your BrightTalk viewing console. It will also be posted to the NSF webpage on SNIA.org. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jay Metz to discuss this series. Jay?
Thanks, Steve. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first in the series of the storage security. There's no shortage of information out on the interwebs that talk about security, and there's a lot of information about storage too. So you're probably wondering, okay, why are we doing yet another one? Well, it seems that we hear more and more information about massive data breaches by large corporations almost every week. And by this point in time, almost everybody's had their personal and private information stolen in some fashion. So to that end, one of the things that becomes apparent very quickly is that a lot of the security conversations tend to focus on non-storage related areas. That is, if you're a programmer, there's a lot of information about how to secure your code. And if you're a networking person, there's a lot of information about how to secure the traffic on the wire, often in excruciating detail. What's hard to find, however, is how security can be seen from a storage perspective. So that's what this is. What you're watching right now is the beginning of a series of webinars dedicated to understand security from the point of view of storage. And when we started to think about this from at first, we originally intended to have a single webinar that gave a glimpse into the kinds of things that people need to know, but then it started getting bigger and bigger. And pretty soon it became apparent that if you want to follow the data in a follow the bouncing ball kind of way, you had to kind of figure out how to pace yourself. So this series is going to try to take the same approach that we took in some of the other webinars, where we want to be able to provide you with sections dedicated to certain topics that stand on their own, but also fit into a much while we want to remain focused on being storage-oriented. Now, just remember that we aren't going to be able to get to every single aspect of storage security, especially not in a single webinar. So we're not even going to try to swallow the ocean here. Instead, this webinar is going to lay out the foundation for everything else. We're going to be defining our terms, we're going to be discussing the big picture and the global view, And what you see here is a starting point. And over time, we're going to find that additional webinars may even be necessary. We'll see. So how do we do this? Well, most people who work in technology are familiar with layers, software layers, stacks, those kinds of things. So if you bear with me, I'll explain how we view taking a somewhat unique approach. So this is not an official representation of any model of technology, but rather an analogy of how to think about where security touches storage. For instance, we can have issues at the uppermost layer with the human element, and this includes the bad actors, simple human error, or even poor retirees who are taken in by phishing scams. And underneath that, at the software level, there can be bugs and backdoors and other kinds of exploits. And perhaps you remember how simple images on the web could be infected in the exit data, for example. And then you have the issues that can occur at the operating system level, where a lot of the most well-known issues in security tend to occur. And this is a place where a lot of people tend to interact on a personal level with their security, including password policies and some of the built-in vulnerabilities that are patched every Tuesday, for instance. So once we get underneath the operating system, well, this is where things start to get particularly interesting, especially from a storage point of view. Understanding how to protect the data that traverses the network as well as the network itself is worthy of its own webinar. As a matter of fact, it will have its own webinar. And then finally, there's the physical media itself. This is where we get into things like data at rest, physical access to devices, and other potential problem areas. So try to keep these layers in mind as we go through not just this webinar, but through the entire series. Assume that you follow through with it. As we start to talk about the risks and threats, it's useful to know where we're talking about in our big picture. So this model here, if you take a mental picture of this model and the working with layers, you can see them on this particular graphic just shrunk down next to each particular device. It's a little small on the screen, but this is what I mean. We can talk about each of these aspects at every stage along the way. If we want to look at individual devices, you'll have each of these various layers of security to keep track of. They may look a little different from device to device, but they're all there. And when we talk about storage security, though, it's not enough to simply check off the boxes and make sure that any one device is secure at every layer. You also need to understand how you can be vulnerable in other places where you may not have control. So knowing where you are, both in terms of the device component as well as the individual layers that we're talking about, is critical. And here is where we get to the main goal of the series. This is the reason why we started doing this in the first place. You see, storage isn't just about data. It's about making absolutely sure that you solve the one problem of all storage. Give me back the correct bit I asked you to hold on to. If anything gets in the way of being able to provide you back that correct bit, then there's a problem. So for that reason, it helps to also think about the relationship between devices, those spaces in between. And when you think in this way, something of a lateral way of thinking, rather than just up and down the layers vertically, you can get a much more complete picture of where you can find yourself in trouble. And thus is the reason why this particular series is a bit unique. So now that I've been blathering about for a bit, and it's time to get down to brass tacks. So with that, I'll turn it over to John Kim to help us understand the major terminology that we're going to be using throughout the series.
Thank you, Jay. Hello, everyone. This is John Kim, and let me talk about some of the terminology that's involved around storage security. So I'm going to cover, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to cover threats, vulnerabilities, and risk. Then I'll cover attack vector and attack surface. Next will be malware and malicious actor. Then a brief foray into regulations and compliance. And then Pierre will talk about some of the actual objectives and goals of attackers or of security attacks and how they happen. So first, let's define a threat. A threat is a potential attempt to compromise the system or data. So it doesn't mean it actually happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone's actually tried, but it basically means you have a potential, or you have someone said they're going to do it, or you know that someone's tried this type of similar attack somewhere else at another site or another data center. So it's a potential one which seems like it's feasible or it's likely to happen or could happen. And usually the goal is to steal or ransom the data or take control of your systems or cause some downtime. And Pierre will talk more about those specific goals later. The threat could be external or internal. It's usually digital, though in a rare case, a physical threat could be like cutting a fiber optic link or damaging the power supply or the external power supply to the building. And if the threat is actually carried out, then we call that an attack, which may or may not be successful. But again, so a threat is potential attack, and if they carry it out, it becomes an actual attack. Then we have vulnerability. So vulnerability is a design, a gap, or a flaw that increases the susceptibility for a threat. It makes it more likely that an actual attack might succeed. And these usually exist because either the people in charge of the data center or the systems are not aware of a specific threat or not aware of a specific vector. We'll get to vector in a minute. Or they felt that it didn't apply to them or didn't apply in their case. And again, the vulnerability could be in the software, the hardware, or some part of the physical infrastructure. And more on that when we get to the attack vectors. Fine, what's a security risk? A security risk is the chance or probability that something bad could actually happen to your systems or your data. It could be a low probability or a high probability, but you're sort of assessing. I mean, there is, of course, the chance that a meteor could come and wipe out the data center, but that's a really small, so that is a potential risk, but the probability is really small. So usually you don't protect specifically against that. There's also, but anyway, there are different types of potential risks, and you have to assess which are the ones that are most likely, and usually you protect against those first. And they can be security or non-security, and again, physical or online. Usually, the ones you worry about most are security risks and online or digital. So if you have a threat plus a vulnerability combined, that equals a risk. Let's talk about what is an attack vector and an attack surface. An attack vector is a route where a threat could reach a potential vulnerability in your systems or data center. So there are different levels and categories. It could be a social or human angle. It could be in the application or software or operating system. Or it could be a physical, somewhere in the physical layer, on the physical network, a physical USB drive, and putting in an affected drive that you got recycled from somewhere else. It could be a person walking into the data center or sneaking in and putting, plant and carrying out some sort of action or attack there. So the existence of a vector doesn't necessarily mean the attack is going to succeed, but it's a route or a doorway or a potential way for an attack to get to a vulnerability and therefore get into your systems, your software, or your data center, somewhere, some physical aspect of your data center. And the attack surface is the sum of all those attack vectors. So for example, if you have 6 network connections into the data center, which potentially could be a route for an attacker, the network attack surface is the sum of those 6 network connections. If you have 5 doorways into your data center and that an attacker could potentially break into or sneak through, then those doorways together are the sum of the physical access attack vectors, or the attack surface for someone to make a physical entry into your data center. So usually what you want to do is you keep the attack surface as small as possible, as small as it's practically possible, as a security best practice. You usually cannot eliminate all possible attack vectors and therefore make the attack surface 0, though theoretically that's really nice. But it turns out it's usually not practical in real life, so you make it as small as possible, and again, protecting against the most likely threats and against the biggest risks. All right, on to malware and malicious actor, and then my section will be, and then we'll just go through regulations. So malware is a short abbreviation for malicious software, and it's software that is purposely designed to cause damage to a server or application or some other part of your data center. It's usually sent by a malicious actor, and we'll get to that next. And malware could be viruses, worms, Trojan horses, ransomware, spyware, adware. Those are some of the more common categories. And they each have different purposes, which we'll cover in more detail later, and do different things. But generally, it's bad software or evil software that someone intentionally is putting in your data center or trying to get into your data center in order to compromise some data, steal some data, or compromise some of the systems. And who are these malicious actors that might send this malware? So it's a person or organization that attack data or attack systems or both. They're usually in 4 categories. First category is cyber criminal. They're doing it for the money. There are hacktivists who are doing it because it's something to either support something they believe in or fight against something they don't like. There are state-sponsored attackers who are doing some sort of attack to advance the agenda of their own country or to block or thwart or interfere with the agenda or progress of a country that they are against or that they oppose. And finally, there are insider threats, and that's usually an employee or contractor or someone who should be who's trusted or should be trusted with access to your systems or data, who actually is turning out to be planting malware or doing something, inappropriate or evil with your systems or data. And finally, let's talk about regulations and compliance. Regulations are rules that affect how, where, or how long, or you must store or protect the data, or it might regulate how you share it or how you cannot share it, how much privacy you have to have. And this can be prescriptive, telling you what you must do, or prohibitive, telling you what you cannot do. And then there's compliance. Compliance is the practice, agency, or people that ensure the right regulations are being followed at the right times. So compliance could be done by internal employees, by an external agency, or both. If you're in a heavily regulated industry like corporate, like finance, consumer finance, or healthcare, you may have both internal compliance people and external compliance agencies who are checking to make sure you're following all the regulations. And there's usually some kind of penalty if you do not comply properly. It could be anything from a warning to a monetary fine to additional supervision from an external agency or a court. And this slide we won't go into all of these, but shows a list of some common regulations, mostly focusing on the United States, but not all of them. For example, GDPR, the first one, is one that applies to the European Union and regulates both data security and privacy. So there are many regulations here which may dictate how you store the data, how you make sure the data is accurate. As Jay said, making sure that the data that you that you get back when you ask for it is the correct data that was put there in the first place, and that only the correct people or the authorized people have access to it. All right, so that wraps up my section, and I'd like to turn it over now to Pierre to talk about attack objectives and methods.
Thank you, John. So we'll start off with kind of talking about some of the high-level objectives of a person attacking a system or a network. And those can be classified into three main categories: causing a denial of service, or modifying, infiltrating, or exfiltrating data, or impersonating or something. So let's briefly define what denial of service is. And it's pretty much an attack where a perpetrator would render a machine or a resource or a system unavailable for its intended legitimate users by temporarily or indefinitely disrupting the service of the host. So it's usually accomplished by flooding that service or that host with a large number of requests to where that system would be unable to serve legitimate requests. A variant of denial of service attacks is the distributed denial of service, where in concept it is the same as denial of service. The only difference is that the flooding of that host or that service is originating from multiple sources or different sources. Distributed denial of service are typically much harder to stop because in denial of service, usually you would block that source that is causing that increased traffic or those illegitimate requests, and therefore countering that denial of service. Whereas in a distributed denial of service, it is much more difficult because you have many sources that you would have to block, and it becomes tricky identifying which sources are legitimate versus which sources are not. And we will talk around protections for all the attacks that I will mention in the next few slides. Some of them might be coming in a later presentation, but at this point we just want to talk about the different types of attacks and different types of exploits before we jump into the protections. Data infiltration, modification, or exfiltration, just kind of the title says, infiltration is unauthorized ingestion of data, modification, authorized modification of data on a target system, and exfiltration is authorized data transfer from a target system. Is also known as data extrusion or exportation. And you can think of, as example, the data infiltration. If you were adding, bogus data sets into an account, into a system to exploit that system. For example, if you have a database that is hosting bank information, if you were to infiltrate data into that to give the impression that there are additional accounts, legitimate accounts that are available or balances. Modification, the same example would kind of apply. You would change the balance of one account, from one value to another. Exfiltration is where you would exfiltrate data. Could be PII data or any type of data that could be used, that could be valuable for an attacker to either be sold or be used. It really depends on the type of attacker that John had mentioned earlier. And the third type is impersonation, is where would the attacker would successfully assume the identity of a legitimate party and then use that identity to perform illegal or malicious operations, from sending an email or generating transactions or really any type of attacks. And safeguard. So before we jump into the safeguards, to give everybody an idea of how we're structuring this presentation and what we plan on covering in future presentations. So initially, we will discuss about some core concepts to make sure we're all on the same page, and then we can dive into actual safeguards at the different layers of technologies at a later presentation. So for now, we're going to discuss some of the core security concepts that products and solutions need to comply by in order to address or safeguard against pretty much all of the attacks that I mentioned. So the first security concept is the CIA triad, and this has been around for quite a while. It's presented in pretty much any security 101 course, where it talks about, or it covers confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And confidentiality ensures that only authorized users can be permitted to access required information. Integrity ensure that no one can alter the data without proper authorization, and availability ensure that the data resources are available. So the goal of security system is ensuring that the CIA triad is maintained. In addition to that triad, additional concepts that kind of go hand in hand with the CIA triad are authentication, authorization, or accounting, otherwise known as AAA. And authentication is ensuring or verifying that the user is truly who they say they are. Authorization, making sure that the user is allowed to perform or see, to perform an action or see or change data before they're allowed to do that. And accounting, making sure that that all actions are properly recorded, so that users cannot deny the fact that they performed an operation, also known as non-repudiation. So, in order to ensure to properly implement or safeguard the CIA triad and the AAA, there are a number of principles that need to be security principles that need to be introduced into products and applications that would, in order to ensure that those concepts, those core concepts, are safeguarded. And those principles are principle of least privilege, making sure that the user has only enough privilege to perform proper actions and nothing more than that. Separation of duties, ensure that no one person can do all actions, and that for critical actions or for different that the different types of users can only perform the actions that are applicable to the role. Defense in depth, ensuring that we're not only safeguarding the perimeter, so we not only rely on a edge firewall, we also want to make sure that there are different defense layers throughout the system or the solution. Fail secure, in case the system fails, we want it to fail in a secure manner so that it's not wide open for attackers. Simplicity, we want to keep things simple from a design perspective so that we reduce the chance of making design mistakes that could be exploited into by attackers. Trusting nobody, again, assume have no pre-assumed notions of trust. Make sure we authenticate and we authorize everybody in all actions before those actions are permitted. Least common, this is least common mechanisms. So we want to try to not have as many common mechanisms as possible, because if you have a system that provides 5 functionalities and all those functionalities rely on a common mechanism and there's a vulnerability in that mechanism, that means all the functions that rely on that mechanism are now vulnerable. Secure the weakest link. It kind of goes hand in hand where, if by evaluating the attack surface of a product, there's a point that was identified as to be the most vulnerable. For example, if you have a system that has a web interface and we know the web interface is exposed to the internet, we want to ensure that weakest link is probably secure. And finally, we want to leverage existing functionality. So if there's functionality that has been already implemented and it's already been used, we want to make sure that we leverage that. We do not want to rewrite everything from scratch, because that increases the chance of introducing new vulnerabilities and new attack vectors. So we want to take advantage of that existing functionality that has most likely been through security reviews and has been hardened in order to minimize our attack surface. And before I go into do this this next portion, I received a request to briefly talk about non-repudiation, which I mentioned earlier. And really, at a high level, non-repudiation is ensuring that a person cannot deny that they performed a given action. And you'll see a lot of that in the term of digital signatures and certificates, but at the simplest level is just ensuring that if somebody had done an action, we can verify that that user has done that action, and that user cannot deny that they were not the person that done that action. And we're going to cover that more in depth when we talk about encryption in future presentations. But for now, I just wanted to kind of briefly define it since I mentioned it earlier. So talking a little bit about protection. So we have 4 categories for safeguards: safeguarding the people, data, components, and system. And each type of safeguards has can be implemented in a different mechanism. There are some common components or some common concepts across the different categories, but this is a nice presentation to kind of help folks better understand how the safeguards apply to people, data, components, and system. And for this presentation, I will briefly talk about safeguarding the people, and then the rest will be covered in a future webinar. So safeguarding the people we need to first define people, and people can be producers of data, consumers of data, and gatekeepers of data, and we need to ensure that we are safeguarding all those individuals. So if you're producing data, we need to ensure that the data that's producing is not tampered. If you're consuming that data, we need to ensure the authenticity of that data. If you're gatekeeping that data, we need to ensure that you are not vulnerable or you're not used as a means or as a way to compromise that data. So we want to make sure, and this kind of aligns to the concepts that I mentioned on the previous slides. So we want to ensure that we eliminate default credentials. We want to have a good balance between ease of use versus security. So we want to, for example, if we were to, we want to enforce the principle of least privilege. However, that can be conceived as not user-friendly, as for example, having everybody be given administrative access. This way, everybody can perform all the operations. That, from a user perspective, might be easier because they don't have to work with others if we're enforcing, separation of duties or contact administrator to do certain actions. However, from a security perspective, having everybody be given administrative access is a big risk because if one user were to be compromised, that means the entire system or the attacker would be able to compromise the entire system and have administrative access on that system. In addition to that, users have an ethical responsibility to make sure that they are following the procedures to ensure that they are safeguarding the data that they're responsible for, and they also there's a certain level of awareness that users, awareness and training that users have to go through so that they can be aware and safeguarded against phishing and blackmail. We mentioned earlier the insider attack, so there could be potential cases of malicious employees that can introduce some insider attacks. So we also need to be mindful for that, and that's why the notion of defense in depth is very important, because if you're only protecting your perimeter, if you have a malicious user who can access those systems, those perimeter protections are really useless. So you need to ensure that even within a safeguarded environment, each one of the individual components within that environment is also safeguarded, because you can potentially have somebody from the inside, an insider job, that could be launching that attack. And same thing, the last bullet, unintentional infection, kind of goes along the same line of a malicious employee. The employee could not be malicious; it just could be, unaware or uneducated to where they inadvertently introduce, a virus or a worm. So we need to ensure that our systems, our protections, are able to handle that type of attacks or incidents. And with that, I hand it back over to Jay.
Sure. Actually, I think a question came in that you can probably answer for clarification. Steve, you want to ask that question?
Yes, we did have one question. We did have one question come in, Pierre, around trusting the root admin user of a system, since they have, more or less unlimited power over the system. How do you authenticate at that level of power?
So the trust note was really meant in the context of, I send you an email saying that, can you do this for me? Just because, I might be, the email or the request might be originated from somebody that does not mean that you should go and execute that request without properly, validating that the request is legitimate and there's a proper need to know and there's proper authorization. So not to take, we want to ensure that we do our due diligence when we're performing our duties, and we should not, have any notions of presumed trust, whether it's with users or whether with, systems. Now, in the case of an administrator is not going to send a request to you to perform an action that the administrator has access to. And if they're requesting something that they should have access to, then that kind of sounds fishy. Or if they're requesting something that they don't have access to, then that kind of falls under the same guidance that, is there a business reason for them to be able to do that? And is there proper justification, authorization before doing that action?
Okay, great. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about white hat versus black hat hackers and why maybe I would want to use a white hat hacker?
So that kind of goes so another term that you might hear is also ethical hackers, where you would actually contract somebody to perform some assessment on your system to ensure that if there are any vulnerabilities or any potential attack vectors, that those are the owners are made aware of, so they can be properly addressed. Whereas attackers or black hat, those are the not unauthorized, but those are attackers that are not kind of sanctioned by the product owner, and they're just attacking, and they kind of falls under the categories of what John had mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you. And Jay, one for you. I wanted to ask a question around trust boundaries and how you ensure that those are indeed trustworthy.
Yeah, and I'm glad that this question was brought up, because it goes back to the idea of a holistic solution for storage. Because when you start to think about how storage moves from a host to a target, these different areas of initiator, network, and targets may seem pretty simple at first glance, but in reality, when you start to put these things into practice, you wind up with a situation where the owners of the actual pieces of equipment may not be quite so obvious. For instance, in the data center, we have a variety of different form factors that you'll find for different types of storage environments. In a fiber channel environment, for example, you have go all the way into the adapters and go through the switches. So fiber channel is pretty much an adapter to an adapter with a switch in between kind of environment, where the trust boundary ends between the firmware element in the adapter and the target adapter and the end device there. In a Ethernet network, just as another example, you may wind up with different types of trust boundaries. For instance, if I've got a rack-mounted system, my trust may go only as far as the adapter, or it could go, depending upon how you're doing this in a virtualized environment, you could wind up going all the way into the operating system or the hypervisor. In a blade system, or like a blade chassis, for example, pushing virtualized switching all the way back into the host moves that trust boundary closer and closer and closer to the application level, whereas before it was a pretty well-defined aspect of it. So when you start to take a look at this lateral approach to solving a storage problems, that trust boundary is not static. It can move, and it can move in the same data center, whether you've got bare metal servers or you've got virtualized environments, or whether you have rack series of devices, or you have blade series of devices, or if you've got the new composable stuff. And that trust boundary is going to be changing more and more and more as we get into some of the non-volatile solutions, where we are actually doing some very interesting levels across from the host side to the actual media. So the trust boundary is not a static element, and who is in charge of what aspect of this has got to be coordinated from an end perspective, all the way from the person to each of these different components down into the actual storage media. So that's where a trust boundary falls into place.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that. I've got another question on self-encrypting drives. It seems like if I have self-encrypting drives on both ends of my network, that I shouldn't need to do anything else. Pierre, can you respond to that?
Well, self-encrypting drives would protect against somebody, stealing a drive or trying to access a drive outside of the system. But if you're using self-contained drives within a system and the data on those drives is accessed by an application, and the application has the means to read that data, to authenticate and read that data, if the application itself is compromised, whether you're using self-encrypting drives or not, it's not going to matter because the application can read that data, compromising that application and compromising the data that it has access to. So there's definitely a benefit for self-encrypting drive, but just having self-encrypting drive is not in itself, a panacea to all of the security concerns.
Thank you, Pierre. Another one is around just why an attacker would want to infiltrate into a data center. What are some of the reasons for attempting to do that in the first place?
I mean, you can see from all the major breaches that have happened lately, from Equifax to Sony, and just getting access to the data. That data is very valuable, and it has different value for different types of attackers. But again, it's safeguarding that data is the responsibility or ensuring that the systems where that data resides is secure is a responsibility of the solution provider.
Thank you for that clarification. John, one for you. Can you go over authorization versus authentication and what the differences are?
Certainly. And then if I miss some one of the details, then Jay or Pierre can correct me. But so first, authentication is making sure that someone is who they say they are. So if I say I'm John and I want to log in, it's making sure I'm really John, and that I'm not actually Pierre or Peter or Jason Bourne breaking in pretending to be John. Authentication is first. Verify the person is who he or she says he is or she is. Authorization is determining what the person has rights to do. So it could include access controls. It could include basic permissions, saying which applications or which directories or which servers the person has access to. So if, again, I'm John Kim, they've authenticated that I'm really John Kim. Now they want to verify that, what servers or applications can I access, and making sure I only access those and not, for example, the confidential human resources system or the company finance system, and those systems might have detail or information that I don't need to know and I'm not supposed to see. So that's a difference between authentication and authorization.
And to add a little bit more to that around authentication and access control, there are a number of access control models that have been around for a while that you might have heard of, like mandatory access control, MAC, or discretionary access control, DAC, role-based access control, RBAC, and different operating systems implement different types of access controls. Like, for example, the most widely known one, the one used by the U.S. Department of Defense, where uses mandatory access control, where each subject has a classification, and each user has a classification, and the user's classification needs to meet or exceed the subject's classification before it can get access to it. And if there is interest, we can cover different types of access control in a future webinar.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be a lot of interest in that, Pierre. One more question, Pierre, and then we'll move along. How do I determine what's my greatest vulnerability or weakest link in my security? How do I poke at those attack vectors and find out where I have gaps? So really, the best way to do that is to build a threat model for your entire solution. So a threat model will identify all the vectors into your solution, and what are the controls, external controls and internal controls, and what is the most the most critical elements you're trying to safeguard. And based on that information, you can determine
what is your weakest link potentially, what is the data or the resources that are the most valuable, and based on that, you can determine what you need to safeguard the most. So, for example, a web application, usually the main focus of attackers is going to be that web interface that users can that is used to access their applications. So extra precautions or extra safeguards needs to be placed on that interface versus, for example, a connection between that web application and a backend database. You need to safeguard both, but in that particular example, the weakest link would be that web interface that is publicly available over the internet. But again, it's not one size fits all. Building a threat model, and maybe we should discuss threat modeling in a future webinar, would help kind of decompose your solution and help you determine what is critical and what is the weakest link and what is and what safeguards to be put in place.
Thank you, Pierre. I appreciate all the questions coming in. I would like to turn it back over to Jay now, and he can set the stage for the upcoming series.
Oh, great, sure. I'm really excited about some of the stuff we've just been talking about, actually, because as you can see, there's a lot of information that we couldn't get into in the time that we had, and even just talking through some of these things, we've already come up with some additional ideas for being able to talk about everything from access control lists to storage threat models and all these different kinds of things. May wind up being topics unto themselves. It's almost like it's the gift that keeps on giving. Security is a never-ending conversation, it appears. But nevertheless, I mean, even though we couldn't get to everything, we're going to be taking the principles that we've discussed in this particular webinar and diving much, much deeper in each of the following webinars. We're going to be able to afford ourselves the luxury of being able to go deeper into things like encryption and securing the data in transit versus at rest. I mean, all of these things are related. It's one of those moments where you realize that everything is related to everything else, and somehow you have to be able to figure out how to triage the information in such a way that it can be, grokked in a reasonable manner. So obviously, if there's a category or topic that you, our audience, thinks that should be added, by all means, you should let us know. You can write it into the question area or leave a comment when you rate the webinar. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. So by all means, please feel free to offer additional ideas, because we're all about trying to cover our bases. So let's summarize what we've talked about so far, particularly with regards to the purpose of our session here. So the entire purpose of the webinar was to provide an introduction into the world of storage security. Now, unfortunately, we're limited in terms of time to cover every possible aspect that's important, but nevertheless, you got to start somewhere. And one of the things that's really important to remember is that just because you use encryption, or just because you have a password with capital letters, numbers, and a symbol, does not mean that your storage is secure. There are many different areas where attacks can come from. And as we start to go into later areas, we'll be focusing on going up and down that analog of layers. We'll go all the way up to the human element, all the way down into the physical media, and then we'll go across the board as well. We'll go from end to end, while also being able to spend particular time in future webinars about how some of the government regulations, both inside and outside of your country, can wind up affecting how you wind up doing storage. So ultimately, this is a starting point, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for future webinars where we go into greater detail and even a little bit of math, no less. So with that, I hand it back over to you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you, Pierre and John, as well. And thanks to everyone for attending today. We do ask that you rate this webcast. We value your feedback, and we'll use it to develop future presentations. You can get a copy of today's presentation in the attachment tab on the bottom of the BrightTalk platform, or visit the SNIA website with the URL listed there. We will be posting a Q&A blog in the next week or two to address all the questions we received today. I encourage you to follow us on Twitter for announcements on the blog posting, as well as other NSF webcasts. Thank you for attending.